Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webcast, Walk the Talk, taking the first step on your DE&I journey. This event is part of the SHRM webcast series. You can learn about upcoming and on-demand programs from our e-newsletters and the webcast homepage at shrm.org/webcast. SHRM thanks today's sponsor, Eightfold AI, for making this program available to the HR community. Now about today's program. When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, bridging the gap from where you are today to where you want to be requires understanding, acknowledging, and addressing your current state and challenges. This program will provide guidance on operationalizing your journey with concrete, actionable steps. During the program, you'll hear insights from Joshua Bellis of PTC, and Mihir Gandhi from Eightfold AI. Here is some background on our speakers. Joshua Bellis is the head of Global TA Programs, Early Careers, and the operational leader for recruitment in the Americas at PTC. Previously, Mr. Bellis led early career diversity and technology transformation at Fox News and was the first global head of early careers, diversity recruitment, and employer branding at NASDAQ. He is also an associate faculty member in the Human Capital Management program at Columbia University School of Professional Studies. Mihir Gandhi is the Vice President of Strategic Marketing at Eightfold AI. He's also developed and assembled the company's professional services team. Prior to Eightfold, Mr. Gandhi served as Lyft's Director of Operations and General Manager of Northern California. He has also held leadership positions in the healthcare industry for the past decade. With that, I am pleased now to turn over the webcast microphone to our event first speaker, Mihir Gandhi.
Thanks so much, Mike. Appreciate the introduction. Can I get a thumbs up if the audio is coming through all right? Josh? Great. Awesome. Thank you for that. I'm very excited about today's session, and I'm thrilled that we get the opportunity to learn from Josh. I want to thank the attendees for your time. This is a massively important topic, and one that continues to evolve in real time. There's a lot of ground to cover, and we want to make sure to leave a good amount of time for Q&A on the back end, especially given the interest and the number of attendees, so we can maximize on Josh's time and learnings on the strategy and process to start and accelerate the DE&I journey. So Josh, it's good to see you. Good morning from the West Coast. We've both worked in multiple industries, in companies of multiple sizes, from startups to Fortune 100 companies. And DE&I is a pervasive topic across the entire gamut. So let's start with what sounds like maybe a simple question, but I think it's important to build a foundation before we get into the actual operational components of execution. But why are companies focused on DE&I, and what is the problem that they're trying to solve?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I think this is like a huge question. I think people are asking, but also is it for the right reasons? I think is really where it should go, because I think, there's plenty of research and studies out there that show that more diverse workplaces, lead to a bigger bottom line. So if you're just looking at it from a dollars and cents perspective, and then you've got other people who say, it's just the right thing to do. Like, we should be reaching out to people from all different groups to be part of the company, give us more perspective on how we're building our products, what we're doing. And then I think there's a camp of people that are like, well, there's things happening like George Floyd. And so as an organization, from a PR standpoint, we need to tell everyone that we've hired a chief diversity officer. And then it kind of falls flat after that. So I think, there's different reasons why people are on the journey. And I think, part of this conversation is how do we make it an authentic journey? And how do we make sure that it's not just staying, at the top level conversation, and that we're actually starting to move and make progress on this.
Yeah. So, when you say that, one of the things that it leads to is, do the ends justify the means, and how do you then start to influence and build out some of the authenticity and integrity? Because I think a lot of, and we'll get into this down the line on the conversation, but that really shines through on the execution component. We talk about the playbook that we'll go through a little bit later. There's been a lot of chatter, obviously, since George Floyd, but even before then, right? And the problem is we've been trying to solve this problem incorrectly. There's been a lot of chatter and very little action. So can you talk a little bit about just where we are on that spectrum and in the evolution of DE&I programs, certainly over the last 12 months, maybe the last 24 months, and then where you see it going in the future?
Yeah, I think people are getting tired of not seeing results. So, which is frankly a good thing. It kind of needs to happen, unfortunately. I think over the last year or so, there has been increased conversation and maybe, a lot of increased conversation about inclusivity just because everyone's at home. And how are we focusing on making an inclusive workplace when we don't have these in-person interactions? So I think that it's taken an issue, like you said. I mean, it's been, I think companies have really been focused on diversity since the 90s, and they've been focused on, the EEO, results that they have to give, or if they're a government contractor, those reports, and making sure that they've, that they're not getting, a microscope put on them to see, for auditing purposes, et cetera. But I do think that we really haven't moved that far beyond, okay, we have a chief diversity officer, we've got maybe a couple, employee resource groups, but actually really pushing, are we analyzing our advancement practices? Are we, I think what's really opened up even in the last 5 years is attention on boards, executive level roles, people that are in even management positions versus not, attrition rates at early levels and beyond, and specifically with minority groups. So I think that we've moved more into a position where now there's a lot of tools and technology out there that can help us understand what's happening in our workforce. So we're better educated now. But again, people are like, okay, so now I have this data, and I think this is really where we're moved into now in the last 6 months. So I've got my chief diversity officer, I've got, my council set up, I've got all this stuff together, and I've got all this data, now what? And I think that's really over the last 6 months, we're really just seeing a lot of conversation and people really concerned that the same thing that's going to happen when Trayvon, years ago, or, where it's just sort of like all the companies want to put out their big social media statement and the CEOs coming out and they're like, we're committed to this, but how are we committed to it? And how are we actually measuring? And are those same CEOs following up, a year or 5 years later saying, okay, this is what we promised and here's where we ended up. And of course, most don't want to say, well, we thought we'd be here, but we actually didn't quite make it there. But I think that would be actually really powerful for those same CEOs to actually analyze what happened and then correct from this point.
So this is complex, right? What you've described is, and I'll just try to play this back. You described that there was a compliance component, which is maybe where we started, which is, do we have the right EEO? Are we reporting it the right way? But that's reporting, but doesn't necessarily commit to show progress against it. Then what you're saying is we're in the midst of the beginnings of a foundation. So underrepresented minority representation on boards and management, starting to think through attrition. But this is really complex because the next part is really the tough part, and this we're going to get into in the next half an hour, 45 minutes, is, what is the next step? But why is that so hard?
I think because it's something that hasn't been done. I think when people are always looking for the best practice, right? So, okay, I'm in a sales role and, people know that you got to hustle and you got to make 100 calls a day and you got to send out 1,000 emails and that will lead to something, right? And I think we don't really have that. And instead we have a very few amount of companies that are trying to be innovative in the space. And there's a lot of noise, so much noise that I think it's just very confusing, and the limited number of people and resources that companies put to focus on this to actually move it forward. And I think one of the most important things, that the company needs to realize is this is not on the talent acquisition team to increase diversity, and it's not just the HR team. This is about every single person in the company taking ownership for pieces of the journey, right? We all have a responsibility to make sure that all of our fellow colleagues feel, included and that they belong, and that's something that every single person can put in their hand. So I think what we're kind of missing is really the right education, and making people within an organization realize what their role is on the DEI journey. And sure, maybe for me, as someone leading in talent acquisition, it is to figure out, do I have the right equitable processes in my recruitment of people? But then I think that continues on, right? It continues on through the organization. And I think what's happened is it's all sort of just been like, well, you're the head of DEI. Like, why don't you and your one person figure out how to fix this very big issue? So I think with more attention and more people sort of being educated and understanding their role and being included in what are the right solutions, then we'll start to make progress. But I think as long as really it sits on the shoulders of like 2 or 3 people, like how could we expect, that's not how it is with any major, issue that's getting solved in an organization. When there's a big problem, lots of people are involved in solving it. So why is the same attention not being given to this, I think is really the crux of the issue.
So let's actually dive deeper on that. And it's actually the first slide. There's a lot of common pitfalls that you've identified in your research. And let's talk through some of these because, you talked about building coalition. But can you just walk through what some of these common pitfalls are as the audience thinks through what have we tried and what should we be trying?
Yeah, I think, senior support is really important. I think a lot of times these are driven from the senior level, which is great because check, you've got that. But I think other times it is more of a grassroots effort, and it is, at some point you have to get your senior leadership on board with this, or you won't it'll be really hard basically to make it and be successful in this without getting that. But you can do it from top down or bottom up, but it is really essential to moving the strategy along. Speaking of strategy, defining what is the strategy? What does success mean? I think a lot of times we start these ERGs, we have all these fun social events, not that those things aren't important, but how are these groups moving the needle forward, and what does success look like down the road? And I think a lot of times we're so focused on like, well, we need these, employee resource groups, and we're so focused on setting them up, but we don't really think about what's the purpose of it and how is it going to be measured in the end and at what points. And that's, I think, where people get tired, and so then they give up. Because they're like, well, this is just, I went, I made a presentation to senior management. I only asked for like $20,000. They laughed at me because this is a feel-good project. It's not something that's tied to a business goal. You have to keep going with it. And you're going to have people drop off, and you're going to have people that are so excited to get the journey started, and then 20 other things are going to show up. You go out and you find other people, and you keep going with it. But I think, that's what has tended to happen time and time again with all these different, shootings and all, all of a sudden we have this big social media presence, and then all of a sudden it dies down, and it's a roller coaster. And then I do think
that goes back to intention, right? The persistence is driven not out of a response to an acute event, but actually having a strategy and a persistence around what does the short, medium, and long term look like. And one of the things you talked about, when we've talked a lot about this in the past, is setting the wrong kinds of goals, right? And what are the right outcomes? And so, can you help just talk a little bit about, and giving up too early is kind of a piece of this, but what are the right sets of goals, and how do you start to inculcate that across the organization, certainly from senior leaders?
Yeah, I think one of the things to do is figure out how does this relate to the business? And, I know probably most of the people on this call know that, there's a big movement to go from employee resource groups to business resource groups. And I think that's a very intentional nomenclature change. It's not, just like, oh, now we're calling it this. How are these groups solving some of the business challenges, related or not related to diversity, right? Because if you take a group of people, in any one of the organizations, and you give them a big business challenge that we're solving, you've got people from all over the company. You've got a great cross-section of people, arguably. who can solve real business challenges. So I think even thinking through, okay, I've got 5 ERGs right now. What are a couple business problems that we could give to these groups as they're meeting to start talking through whiteboarding? How do we kind of solve this? And I think that's one thing, because you're getting all these people in a room together to talk about something outside of, when the next, event or the career fair, again, those are important things, but I think it's about that. And then I think it's also about, and we're probably going to talk about this more later too, but it's thinking, more long-term than how far did we get in 3 months, in 1 quarter. And I think that's where people give up too early, is they are like, okay, well, we didn't increase the employee population by 20%, so it's not working. And I think for a lot of these things, it's all about relationships. It takes time to build relationships with people. I mean, just think about any interaction you have with coworkers when you're starting a new company, new clients that you're trying to get on. It takes time. And the same thing with these partnerships internally, it's going to take time to build that. So I would say, use the metrics that you have as a baseline understanding, right? I think it's important to share with employees, like, here's where we're at with what we're measuring, and also think about what maybe you're not measuring. It's very common to know race, ethnicity, gender of your employees, but there's a lot of other lenses of diversity as well. How are we thinking about that? One of the measures of success could just be, finding out, maybe you don't know really what your military, your veteran, population is. Maybe you don't know the age and the generational differences. And, there's so many different ways to go about it. So maybe part of the success are things like engaging those groups. And then other parts of the success are thinking about, are we attracting people within all these different groups into our talent pool? And what programs do we have to support people who are trying to get from an entry-level position into a management position? Do we have the right structures in place to actually help people do those things? So that's like a level one. These are just conversations that should happen. But I think success does mean different things to different organizations, and that's okay. And I don't think we're here today to be like, this is the bar that everyone should be at, because I do think it's different, but I do think that you've got to sit down and decide what would be impactful to our organization and wherever it is that we're starting on the journey.
And I saw a question come through. ERG is Employee Resource Group from the audience. And so employee resource groups are typically groups that are formed around affiliations. It could be a military group. It could be parents at work. It could be, Black Americans, Hispanic, people of Hispanic descent. So those kinds of subsets of commonalities. One of the interesting things, Josh, you talked about in terms of building coalition was actually bringing the ERGs together, find common ground across the ERGs, so they're not sort of standalone requests or asks that are self-supporting or sort of self-service, but also, hey, when we get the militaries, the military group, the parents group, the Black Business Association together, what are the commonalities and how do we think about it? So when we define success, it's not for one particular subset of the organization. Actually, it permeates across the organization, which sort of leads, I think, into the next topic that I want to dive into, which is, how do you set the right expectations? Because, we alluded to this earlier, when there's, sometimes these massive events that happen and sort of take the social sort of thought by storm, and the airspace, we want to react quickly. We want to do 1,000 push-ups in a day and get stronger, and that's not how it works, right? So can you walk us through how to set the right expectations, not only with executives but also with the employees? Because I think both of those are really important to understand deeper.
Yeah, I think timeline in years, not quarters, is so important. This is, not that progress should be slow. That's not the message here, but it is just about thinking, let's say that you're a 5,000 person organization. To get 1% more is a big raw number, more of any one group into your organization, So you really have to think about, what is the real opportunity even? And how quickly are we hiring? How quickly are we promoting? Are promotions only happening one time a year or twice a year? So, it's got to be looked at sort of, on the spectrum of like, what's really even possible. And then you start dissecting into these like smaller milestones that, are stretch goals, I think is the best way to put it, right? You don't want it to be like, okay, well, we're already hiring like 5% more every quarter, so like, we'll just keep that. That's okay. Push yourself. And it's fine also to say, we didn't quite make it there. I think people are just so, because the idea of a goal was like, we must hit it, But I think if you set the bar lower, it's likely that you'll like hit it and you probably won't go that much further. But if you set it a little bit further, you probably will be somewhere between the goal and what you, between where you're at now and where you really want to be. So I just think it's important, to focus on what's the 5-year plan when it comes to moving the needle. And I think especially at the beginning, the conversation has got to get away from, how many, and it's got to get to number one, representation, because, and I'm getting a little bit further ahead of myself, but you just don't focus so much on the very specific raw number. You've got to focus on activities will eventually lead me to the right number. It's the same, sales mentality of like, I've got to do all these activities and set the process in place in order to end up with the sale at the end, and actually getting the goal. And then I think, for the second point, quantifiable can drive unintended consequences. We don't want to tell managers and recruiters necessarily that they have to hit a certain milestone at a certain time, because then that leads to really what I call, bad behaviors of recruiters going through LinkedIn and like, oh, well, you look female, you look, brown, like let's put you in the pool. And the same thing with the hiring manager, it puts undue stress on them to be sitting in front of someone who could be such a great candidate, but they're not even really focused on that. They're just like, oh, I've got to like increase diversity. And that's not what we want, because now you're hiring someone, you're setting them up to fail in the role. So then that's going to lead to other problems. So you want to make sure that this isn't about lowering the bar. It's not about hitting these exact targets from day one. It is more about this longer journey. And finally, more is not better.
Well, so actually, can we pause on that for a second? Because one of the things you mentioned earlier in a previous conversation was really interesting, which is the quantifiable goals that lead to unintended consequences. We had this conversation around recruiting from HBCUs. And you have a very specific point of view on this, and I think it's very helpful to hear you talk through it. So I'd love to hear you talk about like recruitment strategies. Forget retention for a second, but really recruitment strategies.
Yeah, I would say, everyone's like, let's go to the HBCUs, like that's where we go. And for anyone who doesn't know what that stands for, it's historically Black colleges and universities. There's also HSI, Hispanic serving institutions. And people feel like the recruiting strategy has got to be based on that in order to grow your employee population in the early careers areas. But when you really think about it, these are all really small schools. And again, I just want to be very clear. I'm not saying do not recruit from these schools. You should absolutely go to them. But when you think about like what University of Miami or University of Illinois is graduating in terms of raw numbers, there's much higher levels of diversity at these other schools, and that shouldn't be discounted, And I think so often it's like the first thing at every company I've ever started is, well, what HBCUs are you targeting? Where are you going? And, like I said, you should go there, but what you should do is look at the schools where you're going to have the biggest ROI, whether it's, you're looking at people who are graduating with majors that make sense for your industry, as well as you're looking at those diversity numbers of who's coming out of those programs that you need talent from. But you should also consider who else is there, right? Can I compete with Google and Amazon taking 40% of the top of the class? And if not, should I put all my eggs in the HBCU basket? And that's what I really, this is not to say don't go to HBCUs, but you can find really great diverse talent at so many schools, and some of the bigger schools, you're going to have a much higher return on investment if you can only go to a handful. And then like what I do is I look, okay, I'm going to these big schools. What HBCUs are close by where I can like spend an extra day and I can go to those schools as well. So, there's a way to have it all. But yeah.
And it's also, I think, a component of that is building the employer brand over a period of time. We talked about, 1 year massive presence, first year massive presence on a campus for campus recruiting doesn't really do all that much, right? The walk the talk is year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, and building from 1 recruit to 2 to 4 to 8, and seeing success of those alum come back. And so I think there's something here about staying the course and the timeline in years and not quarters. And more is not better. Now, I want to keep an eye on time here because I do want to talk about, let's get into the concrete piece of this. What does infrastructure look like? And you built a really nice slide that encompasses it. So I'd love to have you walk through each of these pieces in a bit of detail to help us understand, how do you build the infrastructure to manage the change? Once you have developed a recruitment retention strategy, or you've set the intention around it and defined what success looks like, how do you make sure that the organization is ready for that change so that you're not trying to turn left, but the wheel, or turn right if you're in NASCAR and the wheel only turns left?
Yeah, so, this is a big challenge. I'm not going to go run through this like it's so easy to do. But I do think, keep in mind at all times, lead with data. If I don't have the data internally, I need to get the data from external sources. And it's all over the place. Even if you can't pay for a big study, tons of organizations are dying to have a call with you and they'll exchange your email address for a really nice study that was well done. And you can get a lot of data. But the historical processes is you really do need to understand what have we been doing, and which of those things have maybe led to success in certain areas, and which of these things is maybe actually contributing to why we're not moving the needle forward. So when I say this as an example, you might look at your recruiting pipeline, right? And you'll take a sampling of 10 different roles and just look at, what was my diversity like at the absolute top of funnel? What did it look like after we screened through the resumes? What did it look like after we did a first round and all the way to the final round? And you want to understand from that, where was the drop-off? Was the percentage of drop-off with underrepresented candidates and non-underrepresented and male and female and all the way down the line? Where did we end up with the candidate at the end? And was there a significant drop-off at any point? Because that's what's going to be your signal of oh, well, we had all these people at the top of funnel, it was great, and then we did the resume screen. What that tells me is the qualifications, we weren't pulling in the right pool of candidates because we dropped all these people at that stage. Is just the basic qualifications on your resume, right? If it was at another stage, maybe it was interview. You also want to be careful, and this is kind of getting down to the keep managers accountable. It's not about pointing fingers and say, well, talent acquisition, we delivered the full slate of diverse candidates and you screened them out, once they got to you, so you must have a bias. That's not the best way to go about that, but you do want to show the data, right? Here's what the whole funnel looked like. Here's where things were dropping out. Let's now have a conversation about, maybe let's review the job description. Let's review the notes. And this is why it's so essential for anyone out there in talent acquisition to really understand why managers are saying no to candidates. Because those are the notes from the historical piece that you go back to and you say, well, if we had known that this was supposed to be in the job description, this candidate wouldn't have even made it into the pool. And we could have gone out and found some qualified applicants. So you want to use the data, again, lead with data to the managers to keep them accountable. But part of that is also not allowing managers to say, I'm not interested in this candidate, and that be the end of the conversation. It's got to be the follow-up. Oh, okay, totally great. Can you help me understand why that candidate was not a great fit? Because I don't want to send you any more. I want to make sure that we're getting closer to what it is that you want. So those follow-up questions and really documenting, why are people getting passed? Then you go back and you compare that whole funnel, and you should come up with some reasonable, assumptions about what needs to be done to fix that problem.
When you talk about that, there's two things that come to mind. The first is there a communication gap? Right? I'm originally from South Texas. We communicate slightly differently from New Yorkers. or from Californians. And that's just a regional difference, right? Forget gender, forget culture, forget ethnicity, and, you know, sort of all the other components. And understanding what questions are being asked and why they're being asked, how they're being asked, and helping educate, right, from the point of, are we trying to understand the why yes on each candidate? And the other thing is, you mentioned like a level playing field, right, getting beyond that. And this is, I think, a place where technology has come in and starting to help us understand the why yes around different candidates, independent of you know, some of the diversity factors. Would love to hear you talk about that a little bit on the manager accountability, and it's really like you know, what does the partnership look like in doing that, to transition from being simply talent acquisition to actually talent advisors?
Yeah, I would say, you know, it is about getting trust at the end of the day, you know, because you don't want managers to feel like you're, you know, accusing them of not being fair in the process. But I do think that there is an education component that says, look, we're really focused on making sure we get the right candidates into these roles. You know, we're also focused on diversity, but those two things are not, you know, it's not interchangeable. It should be one interconnected journey of these things. So part of it is about the education, about the intake process that you have when you're opening a new role, making sure that you've communicated to the manager, hey, opening this role here is really going to reduce our chances of getting diverse candidates, or opening the role at this salary. If we were to make it a remote role, if we were to put it in this office, like, you really need to become, you know, again, leading with the data, you're really becoming an expert, and that manager is like, oh, I didn't realize that, you know? So before you even get a candidate in front of a manager, it's all about setting up those steps and the expectations and making sure that the right skills, years of experience, all of that. You know, I even recommend really not having preferred skills on a job description, because most likely that's what you're going to end up going with. So really just decide on what are the skills that you want, because then, you know, you can have a really valuable conversation about each candidate as they go through the process. And the first thing you can say is, you know, when the hiring manager's like, I want to move forward, I don't want to move forward with this person because they don't have X, Y, and Z. And you look back at the job description, you're like, well, we never talked about that, you know? So these are the things that, like, you want to have these conversations. Then the hiring managers, you're also sort of training, you know, to move over to that a little bit, you know, you're training your hiring managers on what exactly it means to open a position, and looking at it a little bit more differently than, okay, I had 20 minutes, I wrote a job description, I sent it, the recruiter didn't even read it, they posted it on the website, and here we are with my resumes. You know, it's being more intentional about those earlier conversations and setting that up. That's how you end up keeping the manager accountable, because you said, look, we had an hour-long intake meeting. I showed you the data. I showed you what would happen. We talked about the skills. And now you're saying, you know, that job description almost becomes a contract between the recruiting team and the hiring manager. And you've promised to deliver on that. And so both parties are responsible for that. And that's, you know, it's an important conversation, I think, once you get further down into the process. Did that kind of answer?
Yeah, absolutely. It made me think, I had an experience where I shared a recruiter with a couple of other hiring managers at a previous company. And we were very good friends. And she'd asked me, you know, how I should handle a particular situation. She wasn't getting the right candidates for one of the other hiring managers who I was friends with and am friends with. And I took a look at the job, and it was the operations manager for product and marketing strategy. And I mean, I have no idea what that means. And so I was having coffee with the other hiring manager later, and I asked her how hiring was going. And she said, I can't get any good candidates. You know, HR's not bringing me the right people, et cetera, et cetera. I was like, look, I don't even know what you're hiring for on this role. And we dug into it, and what it came out was she really wanted an analyst, like a data analyst, but she wanted a title that sounded more elevated. And I was like, why are you playing games? Like, no one's going to know what to apply for or who's going to apply. You're just going to get a lot of, frankly, just thrash. You're slowing down your HR team, the TA team. Why don't you just be a bit more intentional and direct? And then so she went back and changed the title later. But I thought it was an interesting tactic, right, for HR to build coalition with one of the peers and ask for guidance on how they should handle something. And then there's a manager-to-manager conversation, which just helps sort of, it helps the entire organization move more nimbly and reduce, poor candidate experience, poor recruiter experience. But, as we think about that keeping managers accountable, it's not only your job, right? And there are other channels and opportunities to do that.
Completely, yeah. And I know we're low on time. I did just want to hit on a couple other things on here because I think it's important. Contract to hire is a really valuable tool in hiring people who have 90% of the skills, and you need them to learn 10% more to really be where they need to be the full-time hire. That's a great resource to use to pull in and use sort of non-traditional, maybe that's how you test out boot camps for technical roles instead of hiring people for 4-year degrees. Offer it at a contract if your managers are really like, I don't know, this is scary. Then you've got a set time, an agreed upon end date. But if you really love the candidate, you can make them to hire. And then I think really important to underscore in this presentation is the partnerships. Even with building partnerships, if you want to go out to Society of Women Engineers, or there's like a million different organizations out there, they really, you've really got to put the time in with them. It's the same thing with the campus recruiting. You can't just go to the college for 1 year and expect anything, frankly. And it's the same thing with these partners. You've got to show up year after year. You've got to really understand what the user base is, who the people are that are members of these organizations, and spend time with them. And then you start to see the strategy, the content that's happening at these organizations to educate these individuals then starts to mirror what it is that your goals are, because they see that you're really not just here to pick off a couple people and then you'll be on your way. So it really is about picking a small amount of organizations that you can really focus on a genuine partnership with. And from a social media standpoint, I think it must be said, everybody, there's all the criticism out there about, using clip art, because we don't have a diverse population and we got to have, one of everything and the person with the wheelchair. And, I just think it's really, you kind of want to stay away from a lot of that because it's really disingenuous. A lot of people really don't like it. There's more people with disabilities that you can't see than you can, I just think there's so many aspects of it. So I think the most important thing with social media is just be genuine, take real pictures, share real stories about your employees. Of course, you can pick people from one of each employee resource group, or you can, make sure that you're showing that you're diverse, but you want to be really careful that every single picture doesn't look like it's fully staged and that you pulled it out of a clip art book, because that starts to do the opposite thing for your brand. And then, of course, under all of this is constant measurement of everything. How did all those social media posts perform? Did anyone go from the social media post to the career page? You want to know every detail that you can, because that's going to help you figure out, okay, we need more of this kind of story. Look at how successful contract to hire has been in these 3 businesses. What can we do to do something more with that? So that's what that, measure to improve is all about.
We got a question that came through, and it's, if we don't know how candidates identify themselves and we're not allowed to ask, how do we analyze the funnel? And actually, this is a place where technology does help quite a bit, right? The ability to infer with a high level of confidence, ethnicity, gender, et cetera. It's never going to be 100%. And the goal is not to get to precision, it's to get to accuracy. It's not 89.73, it's we're in the high 80s. And so, this is, I think, where technology helps bring global data or mass data, big data, to bear. And again, the idea here is to support the measurement and the measure to improve. Now, with an eye on time, I do want to get to the playbook, because I think it's extremely important as you talk about how do we bring all this together and how do we give people what does that wheel look like over time. So I'm going to flip over to that, Josh, and I would love for you to just run us through this.
Yeah. So the first step is really data gathering, and I think part of that is, to the last question that you were just talking about, it's also making sure that you're asking every single applicant, and if they didn't fill it out in the application process, that you're asking again when they get hired as part of their new hire, for them to, but they can always choose not to identify, and we don't want to take that away from people, and we also don't want to make assumptions and fill it out for people ever, because that's terrible. So it is about looking at who has identified, and when you get to your funnel, that's really what you're looking at. So it doesn't mean that, yes, you maybe do have a slightly higher number, but, So making sure you've got the right data, making sure you're asking the right questions, making sure that you're not, sometimes people want to ask every single little question. It's not about that. It's about really like, what is it that we need to know to help us push our strategy forward, and making sure you're asking those questions. And as you'll see in each one of these, key stakeholders that you would want to involve in as part of this playbook strategy. If you have a people analytics team, those people. Sometimes you don't have a people analytics team, it is the HR ops team pulling the data, the talent leadership team, and the executive sponsor. All these people should be fully involved. Executive sponsorship should not go overlooked. It is an essential part of moving this entire program along. So you want to make sure that you get someone at a super, S or EVP level to sponsor a lot of these activities, because they're the ones who are going to remove roadblocks and who are going to give you invaluable feedback about how to present, or what to avoid when you're making a presentation. You really need that person to help drive this whole thing through. So you're going to see that person along the way.
One of the things that we also talked about was using ERGs to identify an executive sponsor. And so not just going sort of blindly, but going through an affiliate group that they have a personal interest or a vested interest in. And then after that, we talked about goal setting. So talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, so it is about figuring out what are the right goals for your organization, and they don't all have to be numerical, but I do suggest that you do have some sort of a goal that can be tracked. And so that is going to be some numerical goals, and some may be like, we need to start 2 more ERGs, or it may be something else, but things that can actually be measured. And so obviously you want the talent leadership team involved in this, all the leadership from the ERG organizations, which sometimes is its own diversity council. I've also seen a separate diversity council from the ERG leadership, but some combination of that. If there's a company enablement team, you want them on board, because this is all about change management. It's all about communications, making sure the right people find out at the right time, making sure that there's buy-in in all of this. It can't be something, again, that just happens in the DEI department and they send out a big company email about something and it disappears into the atmosphere. It's got to be something where people know what the goals are, and that the company is committed and the leadership is on board with it. And this is like essential to the rest of this working. So there you go. Execution. Once it's been communicated and you've committed to it and it's been announced, now you've got HR involved, from obviously the promotions aspect, from the retention aspect, talent acquisition, from attracting talent to the organization, the employer brand, the analytics team to actually looking at how are we moving the needle between attraction and advancement. And then of course, hiring managers play a hugely invaluable role, not just in hiring people, but also in making sure that they are adopting inclusive practices within their departments, and that all the people managers, that we're holding on to employees and we're listening to them, and that we're providing that safe place for people to be.
Now, collecting the feedback, this is one of my favorite parts.
Yeah. So, I mean, you need feedback, right? Most companies do at least one employee engagement survey. I don't think that's quite enough. Maybe one long one, and you should do a pulse every now and then. But you do need to understand how employees feel about some of the new rollouts, the different changes. You want to get engagement scores to understand and split up and be able to look at different groups in the organization and say, why do these two groups feel their engagement score is so much lower? Like, these are all huge opportunities to then go back and put things into the strategy. So employees, candidates, hiring managers, you want to survey each of these different learning journeys so that you can develop a strategy around making sure that those groups of people are successful in what we're trying to accomplish at the end here. And finally, just the goal monitoring. So how did we do? Where did we miss? And from the feedback, and the goals that you set, you're going to see where you missed, right? And you're going to know, well, it's obvious we didn't make it because, look, we did great at attracting and bringing people in, but then they got here and they felt disconnected. How do we hone in on that piece and make sure that as we go through the next iteration that we are boosting that up as well?
So, as we move into questions, and there's a lot of questions in the Q&A chat, and I want to make sure we get to that because I think that's really where a lot of the meat is going to be. Also, we have a lot more to go through, and if we had 2 hours, we would take it. Before we move into that, Josh, I just want to thank you for the insights. I look forward to the Q&A. I want to thank the audience for the participation in the chat channel. So we will be getting into that. I also want to invite everyone here to the Eightfold Cultivate Summit. It'll be on August 10th and 11th. There will be multiple tracks. We're going to go deep on DE&I, talent acquisition, talent management, candidate experience, and fundamentally how AI can be a support that powers your total talent strategy across your employees, candidates, and contractors. You'll be hearing from Josh. You'll be hearing from companies like Nationwide, Prudential, Medtronic, AirAsia, Bayer, so on and so forth. And so we're very excited to bring this to the market and to share some of the best practices around the total talent strategies. And so we hope that you can find the time to attend. You can find out more about this at our cultivate.eightfold.ai website on the bottom there. And if you have any more questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Want to thank you again for your time. Here's our website, our information, email address, and phone number. And with that, let me take no more time of this. I'd love to turn it back over and start talking about some Q&A. So if you don't mind, would love, Mike, for you to take it away and help us navigate some of the Q&A.
Very good. We are going to turn to audience questions in just a moment. SHRM thanks Eightfold AI for sponsoring this program and SHRM's series of free webcasts. Eightfold AI delivers the talent intelligence platform, the most effective way for companies to retain top performers, upskill and reskill the workforce, recruit top talent efficiently, and reach diversity goals. Eightfold AI's deep learning artificial intelligence platform empowers enterprises to turn talent management into a competitive advantage. For more information, visit eightfold.ai. Let's start with some of the questions that are coming in. We'll begin with this one from an audience member who asks, what would be a viable resource, metrics, or material to convince senior management to buy into DE&I initiatives? What are they actually looking for?
Yeah, so I would say, you could start with, there's so many different organizations that have done studies on increase, more diversity in an organization leads to higher profits. I think, whenever you can talk about, bottom line growth, I think, that gets people's attention immediately. But I'd also say, as you're looking at what the talent market looks like into the future, right? And if you want your company to survive, and you're going to have to, show that you're a company that is interested in, I think the ship has sailed on millennials, but Gen Z, people. And a lot of the candidates now, that's what they're focused on. What companies are focused on inclusive practices and that are actually enabling those? I am hearing this question constantly from candidates. What inclusive business practices do you follow? What is your vendor policy? What, all of these different things that, executives may not know because, again, obviously, they're not focused on talking to candidates every day, but it is important to bubble some of that information and package it together and show it to executives that yes, it is about profit. It is about that as well, but it's also about being attractive out in the talent marketplace and being able to continuously go after top talent. And if you are behind on these diversity initiatives, it's no longer going to be a nice to have strategy for organizations. It is going to impact the profit at the end of the day, and it's going to impact the talent that you can bring in. So, I think those are pretty compelling reasons, but that's where I would start if it were me.
Continuing with our questions, audience member asks, how do we evaluate diversity during the recruiting process? How do we get those data points without just assuming based on what a candidate looks like versus how they identify?
Yeah, so there's, great technologies out there like Eightfold who can help you understand what's happening in the talent pipeline. Tons of ATS, applicant tracking systems, tons of other products as well have visibility in real time. Usually after you have 5 or more candidates, you can see the breakdown percentage-wise of what's happening in the pipeline. So at least you can get visibility into what's happening at the top level. If you use, an artificial intelligence, like Eightfold, you'll be able to see, who among those people are qualified for the job based on the skill sets in the resume and the skill sets of the candidate. So there's some great technology out there to help with that. But at the bare minimum, almost any ATS, you should be able to see, pull a report of the application flow and where people are. And then, like I said earlier, you want to look at that funnel and start analyzing where are people dropping out. So you can do that analysis real time before you get to the final candidate. And you can say, oh, I've got a lot of, whatever diverse is for your organization, I've got a lot of females falling out at this stage. Maybe we need to go back and edit the job description and repost it. So those are some things I would think about.
Yeah, and I want to underscore something that Josh mentioned a second ago, which is if you simply look at the classifications that people have self-identified as and manage those through the funnel, the filter on that's oftentimes missing is, are these candidates qualified, fundamentally qualified, based on what we're looking for out of this particular requisition or out of this particular job? That's a very manual task to go through all candidates to do that and then cross-link that. It is a place where artificial intelligence helps drive that distinction, and actually it allows you then to identify, okay, here are the candidates who are qualified for the role, 5-star, 4-star, 3-star match, right? Which is, in the Eightfold algorithm, our algorithms are actually EEOC algorithms. They don't look at name, gender, age, ethnicity, so on and so forth. And so you really level the playing field, not only across candidates, but also internal candidates. External candidates and internal candidates. So now you're actually comparing apples to apples in a little bit of a different way. But again, their technology is here to support you to do that. Mike?
Okay, I think we may have time for one more question here. We've got an audience member who asked this. Much of the DEI training I attend is about hiring. For a small company, we don't actually do that much hiring. Do you have recommendations for equity and inclusion growth for the employees that are already part of the team, or where we can go for guidance?
Yeah, certainly. I think that's really where, you want to have, for small organizations, you may not have, enough employees to have 10 different employee resource groups, right? But I do think that there could be a diversity council, like in smaller organizations. There should be conversations about inclusion. I think this is where surveying your employees is really important to understand, what parts of what happened in the culture here are boosting the morale and what are parts that maybe could use some work. So I would say, with a small organization, you have a really great opportunity, frankly, to connect more one-on-one with your organization and just ask, what is it that you want to see more of? Because I think there's, you can do events, you can do, all kinds of different things with your employees, but I think what's the best strategy is to really ask them, survey them, ask them what they want to see, really try to dig in and understand if you're getting poor scores, why you're getting poor scores, and then let employees know what you're doing about the survey that they took. Because so often it's like, oh, another survey that we'll never hear the results to. You know, it's a really brave thing to do, but in the small organizations that I've been a part of, I think it's been great that we've actually seen, like, here are the results to the whole company in the all hands meeting. You know, this is how we did. And so that opens a lot of, you know, a lot of ears and a lot of eyes in terms of making sure that, oh, wow, so this we're actually going to do. Here's what the results are, and now the company said they're going to do X, Y, and Z. So that's, again, you know, how I would address that.
All right, thank you. With that question and answer, we're going to begin bringing today's webcast to a close. Before we sign off, Sherm wants to thank Joshua Bellis from PTC and Mihir Gandhi from Eightfold AI for their time and the insights they provided over the last hour. And we want to thank everyone in the audience for being online with us today and for choosing Sherm for HR Webcasts. That concludes today's program.